I want to introduce Devon Kerr. He's Elastic's Director of Threat Research and the founder of Elastic Security Labs, a team of researchers with expertise in the malware, intelligence, vulnerability research, incident response, and security engineering expertise. In addition to monitoring global telemetry to identify and disrupt adversaries, he and his team develop mitigations and capabilities for Elastic Security Solutions and its users, discover previously unknown threats, track groups and campaigns, and coordinate security research across Elastic Security to help democratize access to knowledge and resources. Devon formerly led the Endgame Response Applied Research team and held technical roles at FireEye and Mandiant, leading incident response and eviction efforts across practically all industry verticals and regions. And I want to make sure that we thank him for being one of our speakers. So thank you very much. And take it away.
So this is actually super cool because it's been 10 years almost exactly since I've been at BSides Rochester talking to a group of folks just like this, and nothing gets me in a better mood than nostalgia. So today we're going to talk about some long-running PRC campaigns that my team's identified. And the reason we're talking about them is not because they're capable of impacting 500 million people who live in the region. It's not because there's conventional and like novel threat stuff that they did that's super cool. They did those things. You're going to hear about it. You can read more about it online. The most important parts of this are not what they did and why. But usually I agree that's the most interesting part of the story. Instead, I want you throughout this to think about your environment, the one that you spend the most time in, the one that you're responsible for, and what you might need to do in order to shape that terrain to your advantage. And I'm going to give you a whole bunch of case studies about people who failed that lesson, and we can all learn from this. So time is tight. I'm not as interesting as this topic. If you want to talk to me, I will be here. I live here. I operate businesses here, so it's very active. This is one of those topics that I spend a lot of time on, but are there any fans of like cognitive science in the room? Awesome. I wanted to see hands, and I'm glad I got them. Cognitive science plays a really big role in intelligence analysis, and there's a fact about your brain you may not realize. You can't read and listen effectively at the same time. So what I've got for you in terms of slides is actually a bunch of really interesting reference images. I can thank Google Gemini for creating a lot of them, but they provide an interesting backdrop that I think they got it wrong a lot. But for me, actually, that was one of the more fun parts of putting this together. So I'm going to try and give you absolute basics. China's ambitions include seizing the South China Sea. It's a region where a lot of people live. It is a place that has considerable resources of pretty much all kinds, both mundane as well as unique. China has really few options for continental expansion, and that's a concept that people think about in geopolitics. It pertains to their ability to move back into the continent. And what do they run into? Well, they run into India, they run into Russia, they run into folks who are not going to give up their ground. And although China is a key member of a lot of intergovernmental groups with like a global focus, they often use this along with both diplomatic and maybe less healthy undiplomatic tools in order to gain advantage in those relationships. China also has a really impressive navy, and so we might think of them as a maritime power. But the definition of that, according to geopolitics, they can't really defend themselves primarily from the sea. So they're a continental power, just like Russia, just like a lot of countries. And this is relevant to how they prioritize threats and how they decision make. And we'll touch on a couple of these things. I'm going to warn you a few times that there's generalizations here. So I think that Sarah Payne, who's a famous historian, probably has the best and most nuanced take on this. But essentially, a lot of the continental ambitions of China are to help pacify the Han demographic, which makes up really the core of that country. Western consensus right now suggests that their ambitions towards China and the South China Sea are really about keeping this faction together and united. This also makes up the largest economic faction in the country. And this is really important because the party of Mao knows what happens when a social revolution breaks out. The last time it happened, about 100 years ago, it didn't end very well, and the short version is really unpleasant, but millions and millions of deaths, usually due to famine. And it's also important when we look at this map to realize that a lot of the demographics that they take advantage of, that they oppress, live in buffers. These are places, terrains between them and their neighbors. And so they will always, as a continental power, interpret that as a place where maybe unrest will come from. These are all super important, very high-level concepts about why this is happening. And although we think about China as a continental power, it doesn't mean it doesn't try and touch every corner of the world. You can see on this map, which is a little hard to see actually due to the whiteout, but this is a map of the globe with places where China is establishing naval outposts. They've already basically taken over large parts of the world, Africa, Southeast Asia, South America. They've got naval outposts everywhere. And sometimes they use checkbook diplomacy, which is essentially like financial leverage to get these things built. But they extend their reconnaissance abilities. These are places where they've got sonar and radar now. They've got visual line of sight. These are places where they can refuel that Navy that they really want to project power with. This is also a place that gives them a pretense to be active in these regions, which is important for us when we start to think about this in the cybersecurity context. In Africa, just as one example, Belt and Road Initiative, which is how China sort of funds all this, has built mines, roads, schools, military bases, airfields, all kinds of stuff. And there's a whole subculture of people who track all this. If this is the first time you're hearing about it, I'm sure it sounds very shocking. It's not the most shocking thing you're gonna hear today, so buckle up. I did want to point out that there's two places that we care right now about China's ambitions, and so one of those is at the Strait of Malacca. It's between Indonesia and Malaysia. This is one of the biggest shipping lanes in the world. I think roughly a third of all goods travel through this narrow body of water. And then the other is the Panama Canal. China is the second most common user of the Panama Canal after the United States. So those are, again, very big economic pressures that are active in the world, super relevant to this topic. Let's talk about intergovernmental organizations, very briefly. I'm not gonna bore everybody. I think a lot of this stuff just provides just an interesting backdrop for this threat phenomenon. So BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Since then, 2010, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia just joined this year. And really this is about being able to form policies that have economic benefits to them. When we think about the very high level parts of why there are conflicts for China and BRICS, Russia and China really are pursuing a new world order. They're trying to seek a new world order, at least one where they are dominant or co-equal players in it. They perceive that current world order to be an issue to them, and for folks who've been following history, the modern economic world order is believed to be founded after World War II. We can still carry that forward, and it's starting to shift. But through government agencies like BRICS and ASEAN, some of these world powers are trying to shake things up for their advantage. This is one of the causes of strife between members, because some members want to play nice and others want to upend the apple cart. And that's why even these groups that look really monolithic, they look like groups of allies, are actually really fragmented, and they're kind of pissy about it. One of the most popular goals here right now is to destabilize US currency. BRICS has voted to change that. We'll talk a little bit about why. First up, labor costs. Labor costs in Central and South America are really close to what they are in China. That means China has no longer got leverage as a manufacturer. That's not great, because economic security is really national security. When we think about strategic expansion of navies, especially those with blue water capability that let you force project across an ocean, well, there are not many of them, but China's got one, the United States has one. Indonesia actually has the 4th largest navy in the world, and they built it faster than anyone. So if you're China, that's probably a concern. They happen to be in Southeast Asia. And of course, India. India has massively reinforced its navy. Folks who've been paying attention might have noticed they just put a secret naval base in the Bay of Bengal, which happens to be right where that Strait of Malacca empties out, which again, huge shipping lane. There's some other stuff there with Vietnamese canals. They're trying to improve their ability to get stuff around that part of the world. And that's all about economic and military safety. Rare earth mining. Metal commodities, probably one of the most important topics right now all over South America. Mines are being built to extract these all over Africa. Being extracted, Southeast Asia, being extracted. Everybody's fighting for the same stuff, neodymium, terbium. Brazil is one of the largest producers of rare earth metals, sells everywhere. And so when we think about these commodities, it makes sense that China would invest in those regions. I might have mentioned food security is also national security. In Asia, significant populations rely on agriculture, not just for their livelihoods, but also for trade. Climate change is one of the biggest impacts to this right now. Famine, drought, two of the biggest factors, and as climate change continues to kind of rip through the world, these pressures will get more acute, which will motivate world powers to act on them. So again, these things are all kind of related. Directly and indirectly, this kind of works against China's control over that Han population. And with the addition of UAE and Saudi Arabia, BRICS controls 40 to 50% of the world's oil now. This is really relevant to destabilizing US currency because what is oil traded in? US currency. Since when? Since the end of World War II. We've kind of circled back a little bit on this idea, but because the US dollar is tied to commodities, it's one of the reasons some of those world powers are opposed to it. Moving on, ASEAN. This is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. There's about a dozen member states, several ascendant states, really founded in '67 to help with economic and security issues in the region, which was very fraught at that time. You have to remember the backdrop to this was the Vietnam War. Lots of conflict highlights here, but I think a lot of these will be a little bit more straightforward than South America. We see that there are tensions in the South China Sea. I'll go into all of these a little bit more explicitly with some fun maps. I hope you guys like maps. But really, it's because ASEAN's a non-interventionist state. This has allowed stuff like the coup in Myanmar to go on for a couple years. They try and use economic control to encourage their neighbors and fellow members to behave themselves. But unfortunately, it's a little toothless. And so geopolitically, there's not a lot of options. And that means that they're very easy to pick off. It's very easy to target a member. And we'll talk about some of these campaigns and how they have done that. It is unfortunate how much white space is in this map. For decades, Chinese maps described the imperial dynasty of China with 9 dashes. And this is a really important idea, but it's one that's poorly understood. In 2023, they leaked a new map. This map had a 10th dash, and it represented their ambitions for 2030. You see that Taiwan and a few other islands in the South China Sea are part of what's called the first island chain. By 2030, China intends to have full control of this for reasons. I will go into those reasons, trust me. But also, if we look at what they're trying to achieve with that 10th dash, it is really an obvious process. They're pushing even further out. And remember, they're a continental power, which means they're anticipating resistance from the water. In fact, if you think back to that demographic map, they have an entire coastal population that is itself a buffer to that Han demographic from Western influence. So all of these things are really carefully engineered. The reason this is really important is the second island chain includes Japan, and it includes all of Micronesia. So their goal is to be there by 2050. And things are heating up fast. And again, this is all backdrop to the work that we do and the expressions of this sovereignty that we see. There are actually kind of a lot of issues with China's plans here, but one of the big motivators here is microprocessor competition. Singapore, Taiwan, some of the biggest places manufacturing chips, new plants in Malaysia and Thailand, all competing. And of course, there is a belief that things like AI and quantum computing will really be decided by these hard technologies, these hardware technologies. China believes that, and they've been working against the microprocessor industry, at least in my exposure, since about 2010. This will be a thing that's part of their kind of foreign, adversary approach. They also like buffers. China really needs buffers with its neighbors. And so things like the Himalayas, that's a nice buffer to India, which is another competing power. It's got the Ural Mountains, which doesn't necessarily serve as a buffer to all of Russia, but the mobilized part of it, it certainly does. And we should be really careful as their economy falters, because China only has so many places they can go, and Russia is being less than a great friend right now. So we've talked about all of the background on this. Hopefully this will give a little bit of context for this piece, which is details about espionage campaigns that we're actually talking about. A little bit of background here. Every organization has their own nomenclature. I'm not going to tell you our cryptonyms because there's no public interest. But when we talk about naming threat activity, we name our activities group refs, REF, and then a 4 to 6 digit number. These collapse, these fracture. But essentially, these represent observances of a threat during a campaign. So we've got all the pieces. We've got malware, we've got infrastructure, we've got victims, we've got actions on objectives, et cetera. This is just the language we'll use, and it will come up a couple of times. So Ref 2924, the one that started it all. So this was a compromise of a Southeast Asian foreign government ministry by PRC, using a couple of different novel capabilities, one that we called SiestaGraph alongside NAP Listener and Somni Record implants, typically installed on web servers or email infrastructure. Commands and responses in this case were hidden inside of Microsoft's Graph API, so there was no real way to detect SiestaGraph in the environment. These malware families basically masqueraded as other network services in a place where that is the default form of detection, where there are not endpoints to detect these things. That'll also come up in a moment. When we think about victimology, this threat group singled out a single foreign ministry of a single government. They also touched one utility in Southern Asia. Historical evidence, though, of this campaign suggests that they had successfully targeted and compromised at least 3 other members of ASEAN. I want to emphasize that threats don't just steal money or intellectual property, and that sometimes what they take is life. Because this threat group told us what they cared about. They always do, and this is where cognitive science plays a kind of a double role for us as intelligence analysts, because what they try and achieve informs their objectives with that data. So you can imagine my surprise when we're monitoring this threat and they're dumping the email inboxes of hundreds of foreign service personnel. These are foreign service officers, more specifically. So we can think of them as clandestine personnel. And they were not looking for them under their real names. They were actually looking for them under aliases. So imagine the prize you would get if the threat actor found your name and your address and your travel itinerary because they had dumped your inbox. Sometimes what's waiting for the threat actor is a multi-part WinRAR archive, and sometimes it's something else. And this is one of those cases where we got as close to Jason Bourne as any of us get to get. The real job is usually very mundane. This was crazy exciting. We were actually able to work with that government to recall all of those personnel, which is a story I will never tell. But yeah, usually they'll tell you what they're trying to do. They'll tell you why. And in this case, it was pretty clear. Folks operating under diplomatic cover definitely at risk. This government seemed to agree. So in this environment, we saw lots of malware. We saw SiestaGraph, full-featured backdoor. It was installed on email servers. It basically served as an inline forwarder. It could read all email, even the stuff that they'd encrypted with SMIME, because they delegated that to their on-prem Exchange server. That was a bad idea. And because all of this communication happened over the Graph API, well, what could you possibly see? Very little. And what's really cool about SiestaGraph for folks who followed like US politics for a while, there is a US general who communicated with his mistress via his Outlook drafts, and he did this because he knew that when he sent and she received email, the content would be inspected. So they just wrote it to drafts. Well, guess what happens when you create a draft? It never writes a thread into that buffer. You're never actually sending email. and their entire C2 worked this way. So the Exchange admins who were monitoring these accounts actually had no idea any of this happened. This is one of those things that was super covert, and we were able to disrupt a little bit. But there are other families in the environment. Somni Record I love because it masquerades as a DNS client, but it's not really DNS. It uses these really obtuse TXT strings that are crazy long and base64 encoded to send and receive commands. If you were caching that, you might notice, but in the region where this happened, they weren't. And then once they could, well, they still really couldn't do a whole lot about it because they were looking on the network level for what was not DNS traffic. It was HTTPS. And so their really smart switches knew what kind of traffic it was and just hid it from them. And so all of this happened. It was very hard for them to get their arms around. We saw a couple other things. We saw Dormy in this environment. I'll talk about Dormy in a second. Dormy is another novel backdoor that functions sort of as an IIS module. I'll talk about why that's bad. We also saw ShadowPad. ShadowPad's sort of like the default PRC toolkit right now. Big picture stuff. Code stolen from GitHub appeared in every one of these malware families. Each of these implants was designed primarily to evade network-based detections, but actually on the host, they were clown shoes. It was the sort of stuff that like your entry-level SOC analyst would say, oh, this is very weird and unusual attributes of a binary. It's doing some strange things on the network. I don't know what it is, but I know it's bad. And unfortunately, they just didn't have the experience to make that call. We also saw evidence of web shells, and we think that this was all done through an initial web-facing compromise. We saw some evidence of like proxy shell vulnerabilities being exploited, and then shortly after that, web shell, siestograph, badness, war crimes. This one, I think the victim tried to evict the bad guy several times. We saw evidence of it at least twice. We think that they had made an attempt much earlier that they were confident succeeded and then failed. Unfortunately, they never really got their arms around it. In fact, all of this is still ongoing, 2 years, 3 years out. As of this morning, I checked. So Ref 5961. This is another one of those campaigns. This involved a threat group that had compromised government and other websites to deliver a series of fun malware implants. Eagerbee, Blood Alchemy, Rootbird, Downtown. These are all custom implants that I'll talk a little bit about. You might notice, in some cases in the diagram, they're kind of slinging malware on top of each other, where they've got 2 or 3 implants on a single system. Sophos did excellent research into this. They call their Alpha, Bravo, and Gamma groups in their Crimson Palace report that came out earlier this year. Our intelligence analysts had a blast working with them to kind of understand 2 sides of this. It's one of those cases where the vendors saw each other in the same customer environment and were able to make some magic happen. Super rare. If you ever get the opportunity to do it, really recommend it. All the victims of Ref 5961 were employees of foreign ministries in ASEAN member states. Multiple. Although chairmanship rotates every year, we think that the groups responsible for this particular campaign target all members. And again, historical evidence does support most of that. There are probably 2 or 3 ascendant states that we haven't seen targeted yet, but give it time. When they pick up the chairmanship, I'm sure it'll happen. We did not feel, even though we know who was targeted, what their real goal was. When we look at what the adversary tried to do, they were really just deploying a lot of malware, maintaining persistence, testing multiple payloads iteratively. So version 1, how did that react? Did that get detected? Okay. Stomp it with version 2, version 3. In some cases, we saw them trying different configurations, like different persistence mechanisms or even concurrent persistence, and then disrupting a system. Obviously, environments where they knew they were not going to get caught, even doing these kind of YOLO cowboy things. Big takeaways, Eagerbee was really lightweight. It retrieved almost all of its functionality from C2. So think about the malware, very simple loader, reaches out to a benign Cloudflare protected, outpost, pulls down 2 or 3 bytes, really small amounts of data, reassembles shellcode, and that might be, credential harvesting tool. They moved low and slow. They didn't seem particularly concerned about detection, but they did use dynamic import tables for anti-analysis. That was kind of cool. Rude and Downtown, also very modular. These two had sort of like function registries that they loaded up. So if you were doing in-memory introspection, you wouldn't have seen those until they were called up and actually used. And even in some of those cases, they were using encryption and obfuscation to hide strings. It kind of implies that they were testing security visibility, but we never really confirmed that. Blood Alchemy was super cool. It actually side-loaded itself with a benign application that was vulnerable to search order hijacking. They must have done a lot of research to find something that was like native to the environment. And of course, Eagerby and Downtown, we know that's a positive connection because they share a TLS cert. We saw those two different victims, 2 different times, with concurrent implants like Blood Alchemy and Downtown. So it made it a little bit easier for us to connect those two groups. Finally, Ref 7707. We just talked about this one a little while in public. This was initially focused on the investigation of a single government ministry in South America, in which we discovered malware capabilities like PathLoader and GUIDLoader, which load this implant final draft, which is a lot of fun. It appeared, at least at first, like we were watching a really junior operator using somebody else's toolkit, because they were testing a lot of things and also making choices I would not make. And it showed us that the initial compromise was probably a web server co-located in this environment where it should not have been, right next to, file shares full of diplomatic letters and all kinds of great stuff. We found that a shared local admin password was really the root cause here. And so if you're feeling like, well, no one would ever make that mistake, and this sounds like it's 1995 all over again, yeah, it does. But that's the real world. Like, that is the real world. We could talk about how, like, EDR is dead and all that, and, like, BYOVD has made it, like, impossible to secure stuff, but all this stuff still works. Evidence also told us this was a months-long intrusion, during which they didn't steal any data. They just tested stuff, which is really a great hallmark of espionage. So we were dialed into the fact that this was probably an espionage group, but we didn't know who. We weren't sure. We had not seen them do the thing that told us what their objective was. And everything kind of broke open when we realized that they let domain registration of one of their C2 domains lapse. So for the first half of the investigation, our understanding was an espionage-motivated threat actor had targeted this particular ministry. It wasn't a complete story. We didn't have data theft. We didn't know why. But it did kind of tell us parts of a compelling story. So we kept digging. And when we were looking at their intelligence, doing intelligence analysis of their infrastructure, saw this domain, and we bought it. And look, we thought in good faith that we might see implants call back from that victim that we hadn't identified, maybe unmanaged systems, or maybe even just in the region. We did not expect all the beacons to come from Southeast Asia. That was a surprise. Surprises are fantastic because as I sat there with the intelligence analysts, we looked at all the evidence we had, and then we see these beacons coming out of, well, all of the telecommunications infrastructure of an ASEAN member that would be opposed to China's ambitions in the South China Sea. And what's really crazy is this group of victims included the #1 cellular traffic router for that country. It also included all maritime communications, that's navies and ships. So all of this stuff had military and civilian as well as general governance implications. And that tells a much more compelling espionage story, if I'm totally honest. These different pieces of malware you can read about, I would say remember, PathLoader and GUIDLoader, very similar Windows-based loaders. These are under active development. Like we saw daily builds of these being tested and deployed. All 3 of these families use the same C2, all shared infrastructure, all use the same graph API communication, the exact same version we found in Siesta Graph. Identical implementation. And we saw that final draft is kind of neat because it looks like those other modular backdoors that retrieves most of its functionality from C2. We saw in a number of cases this could generally load any shell code, but they really seem to like PowerPick, SharpPick, credential harvesting. Those tools tend to be detected based on like IOCs in the binaries. So being able to load them this way, which is strictly in memory, final draft never touches disk, often allows them to bypass a lot of those policies. But wait, there's more. I gotta tell Google Gemini did a great job with this graphic because you will not believe the insane prompt that I gave it, and it dropped me this image. So Ref 7707 was also really important because in that exact same environment, we saw a different novel backdoor a couple months earlier. We called it BitSloth. Now, BitSloth is really cool because not only does it demonstrate, again, years of development, it also demonstrates an objective for network evasion. And in this case, it resembles the kind of, intra-process redirection that we see in payloads like Rootbird and Downtown. There's a lot of inspiration shared between these different malware families. It's not enough that we're concluding that they're all developed by the same folks or even used by the same folks, but oh gee, coincidences? I don't like coincidences. And in this case, all of these campaigns have multiple coincidences that sort of stack. So this is like sort of the final lap. You've bore with me for quite a long way, so everybody give yourself a round of applause. You know what happened. You have a sense for why, maybe, but neither of those are actually the thing I want you to take away from this. I think the decisions these adversaries made kind of told us what they wanted to do. Overwhelmingly, they invested in defense evasions of different kinds. And they told us they didn't want to get caught. They told us how they expected to get caught, and they also indirectly told us how they expected not to. And unfortunately, they had even less of a full picture than I did, which is remarkable given how we stitched all of these different campaign narratives together. And it's important to note, these have also been entirely ongoing. None of these engagements, none of these campaigns you've heard about have been stopped. We're working with folks all over the world, particularly in South America and Southeast Asia, to keep visibility. But there's reasons for that, and I'll talk about those too. I don't have time to go into every defense evasion, so I kind of chose the ones I think people will see the most. You can read all about the published materials on the Elastic Security Labs website. I was supposed to point at the logo earlier. I missed my stage direction. But those are things that we've already talked about, and if you want artifacts, IOCs, all that stuff's out there. But this piece isn't. So defense evasion, generalized concept, again, Google Gemini, oh man, we're best friends. I'm not gonna make everybody go to MITRE and read about like the defense evasion tactic category. I think we kind of understand what it means. Masquerading as a legitimate process, obfuscating functions in code, leveraging trusted third parties for C2, deploying as a benign server module. These are all examples of defense evasions these campaigns employed. Everything from pretending to be like a Google updater to dropping a vulnerable driver to unhook the EDR visibility. Like all of that is in this category. We only saw some of it, and some of that stuff's exotic. Now I broke this up by data type because I have a lot of love for detection engineers like myself. So those who think that way, this slide's for you, and those who don't, have some empathy. So during Ref 2924, we saw the Dormy implant installed as an IIS module. These are essentially just DLLs that the server loads. And how many old school offensive researchers do I have? Nobody? Awesome. There was a thing that preceded this called an ISAPI filter, which was one of my favorite persistence mechanisms. You basically just told the web server, anybody sends you a file with a weird extension like this, load this random DLL. I once saw one of those sit persistent for 14 years, never touched. Yeah, that's old school persistence. Well, Microsoft got wise to that and they modified it, and so now there's another version of it that's just as cool. IS modules don't have to be signed, don't have to be verified, get loaded by the web server. The web server is probably gonna be privileged. on-prem is just scary. So this is one of those cases where, we think what the adversary knew was that the analyst would miss this. They would look at the IIS module and say, oh, there's a lot of these suckers in there. They're probably all good. I don't want to go through 150 DLLs and figure out which of these came from Microsoft, which ones didn't. I don't have a tool for that. So they didn't do that, and they didn't detect it. And when we told them about it, they explained that they didn't have a way. Now, this impacted multiple organizations who all responded that way, and that is why I will close that loop in a minute. Now, the only way to really detect dormy is if you have intra-process visibility, specifically if you can monitor and process memory that DLLs are being loaded. Now, yeah, sure, ETW might record that you loaded a DLL from a place at a time, but it won't tell you what it is. In a lot of cases, we found that endpoint visibility would have just precluded all or most of this. And almost immediately, because the malware is super low prevalence, but also it does incredibly sketchy and rare stuff. So the host-based piece is kind of over. From a host-based perspective, they didn't try very hard. They didn't put a lot of effort in from my perspective, and they didn't need to. In none of these environments did they encounter resistance. So none of these places had an endpoint that could have seen any of this. They would have only been able to retroactively go look for it with things like PowerShell and maybe OS Query. We tried talking them through that. They didn't seem very confident in using OS Query, but you got to remember, it's public sector. Government folks have a lot on their mind right now. And so I think there's a group of folks who will look at an adversary that uses a clumsy technique or maybe something that superficially looks unsophisticated and say like, oh man, these guys are clowns. Well, they're minimalists, they're brutalists. They only bring out what they need to. So turn that same snark on their victims actually, because all of this was enabled because victims had not done what we would all consider pretty basic stuff. Sarah asked the question earlier, I think the question earlier was like, how many folks are using an EDR tool? And there were only a couple hands went up. Well, in this environment, there were no people using any tools. There's not even enterprise antivirus, and it's 2025. So because they will use a minimum capability, sometimes that allows them to essentially escape when organizations aren't prepared. These went largely unnoticed, in large part because they did have network visibility. They had network metadata collection. They had some NetFlow stuff. They were collecting most of the inbound and outbound traffic based on major protocols. Unfortunately, that really didn't work because all of the network traffic was encrypted, and a lot of it was to trusted places. And first, I'll talk about encryption. Everybody likes encryption. For the most part, this threat group like HTTPS, they would install on web servers. And fun thing about web servers, they often remotely retrieve content for their own applications. So having them reach out and beacon to a Cloudflare HTTPS IP was not that weird. And unfortunately, a lot of network analysts responsible for this missed it. We also saw that it went hand in hand with the fact that they chose IIS modules for their operational persistence. That combination was really targeted against the SOCs of their specific victims, which we think they had been there before. We think that they've been playing cat and mouse because they seem to really understand those patterns in a way that's more than intuitive, in a way that suggests that they've been there before. We also saw that they deployed web shells everywhere, but they almost never used them. They would often deploy a web shell that we'd never seen them use. They'd test it, go through 4 or 5 functions. We think they had a script for this. And then they would just leave it because they were waiting until we dimed out the next payload and booted that one. And then they would just come in through a web shell and drop another one. And this was a game that we think they've been playing for a couple years. They're really good at it, but they're actually not better than that game. And that's another dynamic that I'll talk about in a minute. We saw a lot of cases that web and script content that was deployed did not get introspected by antivirus on those few systems it was present on. And they also knew this. So we saw them testing different scripting languages at times, sometimes even converting stuff that they previously had working in another language to another language that broke so that they could make sure what was really possible in this environment. Again, they were setting up shop to live there. I promise I will stop saying this, but I'm going to come back to that later. And this diagram from Akamai, I think, does a good job of like generalized DNS name resolution. Their backdoors that resembled DNS essentially, made these requests outbound that were not captured. So they knew that although DNS was being cached in those victim environments, they weren't catching requests for certain types of DNS records. So a TXT lookup, or maybe like try to look up a DKIM filter or something, maybe that got a little too noisy, so they decided to filter out that particular part of the stack. We never got a good answer. But we also saw that in the case of Final Draft, typo squatting was frequently used, essentially taking the names of very popular security and IT products and turning them into C2. I don't know if it was them winking and nodding at security companies like Checkpoint, or if it was them just trying to blend into the noise, or 50-50. But these were things that actually none of the analysts thought were weird. When they saw a bungled like vSphere domain, they just thought someone fat-fingered it, moved on with their lives. There was no follow-up. That was Somni record. So, Siesta Graph, Final Draft, these all use the Graph API for C2. This had a couple impacts really worth noting. So first, Microsoft provided the code used for this. Actually, one of the guys who wrote the Graph API itself wrote some demo code that they just put into Siesta Graph and Final Draft. They just modified it in some very subtle ways and got working C2 out of that. We saw that this basically neutralized them to the victim. You've got an Exchange server that's talking to the Graph API 6 or 7 times every time a user does anything in their inbox. Well, this did the same thing. And so it went into the noise. They never saw it. It doesn't look like beaconing, because if there is no draft command for the implant to download, it just checks in, it gets that count, and then exits. And so there's really very little visibility here. There's not a lot of huge data transfers. And we also saw they didn't use this tool for data theft. They would often move stuff to a web server and then just download it, which is super helpful, because that's exactly how people interact with web servers, right? You just download stuff. Well, the analysts at this particular victim thought so too. It's totally normal, and that was great. Because these use the drafts capability, they don't send any email. Obviously, it's much harder to analyze without some serious consideration. So if you're an enterprise and you can actually like look at people's email drafts, that is a huge privacy implication. Very few security teams are gonna be able to do that or write logic for it. In this case, it would look like gibberish because it was all encoded. And of course, in the case of 7707, we saw them using Google Firebase as a way to distribute Final Draft. So they would reach out to a Firebase protected domain that they'd previously set up, pull down Final Draft, execute it in memory, and then move on. This can be really challenging because they're essentially using all these trusted SaaS platforms to smuggle stuff in. And the option is really to block those or have endpoint visibility. So 50-ish minutes ago, I kind of told you were going to get an overview of these campaigns and operations and a bunch of capabilities, and I hope I upheld that part of the bargain. I want to point out that denouement is French for robot party. If you remember just one thing about this, having control of your environment is the secret, because none of these victims actually had control or understanding of their environment. But if they did, there are so many places where they could achieve different opportunities. There's some lesser takeaways here, but I want you to embrace your role as active defenders. And that's really the call to action here. It isn't fast or free or easy, because it can't be, sorry. But owning your environment actually is really effective. And if it's the right way that works, so if you've tried everything else and your enterprise still doesn't have that squeaky clean feeling, maybe it's time to try something else. First, not everybody's going to be targeted by PRC. That's not a reasonable assumption. Very few people in this room are going to work for orgs that are targeted by China for any reason. But this is a case where we absolutely can learn some things, like how Microsoft's Graph API can be abused for C2 as a general purpose piece of knowledge that's super valuable. They made us a little bit better. Although a lot of espionage groups move edgeward, the conventional stuff still works. Like, yeah, all access attacks on Juniper stuff is going to keep happening, but there will still be environments where you can drop an implant and rock and roll. And so you will do that because it's about the most efficient way to succeed. They don't care if it's cool. They don't get internet points. Only we do. Visibility does not beat capability, but it's kind of a necessary prerequisite. You got to be able to see stuff to stop stuff. I think you actually heard that this morning. Many of the necessary technologies to do this are free. Wink, wink. Please don't consider visibility the end, it's the beginning, because some of these operational groups, they can wipe you out in less than an hour. So if your mean time to remediate is more than that, that is a strategic problem for you. That is a thing to work against. Also, visibility and capability, it may not always be possible. They're kind of table stakes in a lot of ways. Again, my team develops these capabilities, so use them. And finally, we're kind of privileged. If you look at this diagram and you don't know which ones are the monsters, that's kind of telling. But we're really privileged because there's things that we get to experience and see that nobody else in the world can understand, and we get to translate it for them. That's what a lot of this is. I get to see 100 billion telemetry events a year, and a lot of people don't. And so what can I share? This is some stuff that was really useful to us in protecting organizations, and maybe it'll be useful for you. And this is where I would drop the mic, but I feel like the vibe is a little too colorful. How much time do I have? Do I have time to do a question?
Yeah, a couple minutes.
All right, I guess I'll do questions. I didn't expect to. Who's got them?
Just a question. When you were sharing some of the methods of, when you were sharing some of the methods and how they were deploying some of those implants, were you finding anything like logic bombs as well?
Not really. So in all of these environments where they were dropping implants, they knew they wanted to drop an implant, and the primary success criteria was, do I get a callback to C2? We saw them drop multiple implants concurrently. Sometimes we'd watch them drop in a series, but multiple implants, and in the case of web servers, drop implants, write a web shell, test the web shell, test the implant, next system. Most of these were not mass casualty events. Very few of these places had more than like 50 or 60 compromised endpoints, but all of them had the same kind of profile. They talk to the internet. And again, all of these things going directly out to SaaS platforms, cloud providers. The adversary really understood that terrain very well. Yeah, we didn't see any language controls. I will say in some of the phishing lures, we did see them constrain again to foreign service personnel, both by alias and by subject topic.
I just had a quick question about the case you talked about where C2 was being done over DNS queries and the attackers knew which queries were not being monitored. Do you have any idea if that's because they just simply never got blocked, like those queries were never blocked, or if they actually could see like what the SOC center was seeing, like they had eyes into the same systems and et cetera?
See, this is a really good question because it's a question I didn't intend to answer. And I was going to try and avoid it. So we know that they were monitoring members of the security and network monitoring teams. They had their aliases bookmarked, and so every time an email went across those threads, they got a copy of it. We know that they did specific searches for DNS metadata, like they would look for an example substring in their email searches because they wanted to know, is anybody talking about weird DNS stuff? And when they saw there was no chatter, a lot of those queries faded, and then they moved on to other stuff. For example, when they deployed NAP Listener, which was an inline IIS module, they started going and looking at the webmins to see like, oh, is anybody talking about new DLLs that have been created on the web servers? Because they were probably distributing through a file share and trying to put some of these things into backups and see, can I worm these in more persistently? That playbook's pretty common.
Anyone else? A couple. Here, you go.
Can I just say I love questions? I feel like this is the part where I know that folks were paying attention, so it's super exciting. But also because I have no idea what is going to happen when that mic comes up. So this is a lot like Russian roulette. So it's a big dopamine hit for me.
Mine's about the Graph C2 stuff. Were they sending it out of the attacked tenant or out of the attack network to a tenant control, Microsoft tenant controlled by the threat actor?
Yeah.
So if that network, or at the victim's network at the network level, if they had tenant restrictions enabled, they would not have been able to authenticate to an attacker's. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that would be true because they would not be able to allow the user's endpoint to authenticate to another tenant's platform. But what they had done is they had hard-coded their malware to talk to a demo instance that they had registered. So they were able to use a demo instance, a 30-day instance, and we think that something was on the back end going on there where they must have been negotiating to extend that tenant because they didn't change it. So all these years we've been observing this, we have maintained visibility of the back-end infrastructure, and some of it is still functioning. They did stop using pieces of it, but the C2 server components, those nodes are still available. It's one of the reasons we have not shared that particular intelligence data with the public, because connecting to that has risks.
Thanks for sharing the research. As you've gone through viewing these campaigns, I'm kind of intrigued. What have you changed your mind on?
Oh, what do I change my mind on? You know what? When I came into this, I think my years as an IR consultant kind of like it scars you. It's like a kind of shared trauma. I'm sure incident responders in the room are going to nod and feel this, but all these environments that you have absolutely no agency to define, that you still have to go in and protect. I think coming into this process years ago when we first started to deal with CSDGRAPH and Ref 2924 was shock and feeling surprise that a victim would be caught so flat-footed with no basics. But we talked with them, and we talked with other potential victims in the region, and actually what we learned is that's really a Western bias. So there's a cultural phenomenon where you can't really assume blame for some of these things, like it's nobody's fault. But when you approach a victim who has been compromised, how you do that is a really delicate thing. And it has a huge implication for whether they will receive what you have to say or not. So we engaged these groups, and we tried our best to maintain that neutrality, to always be helpful, to realize that, like, for us it was just a Thursday. For them it was like the end of their career. And what we learned is that there was not a lot of folks in these orgs who were there long enough to implement institutional change. You know, some of them as careerists were trying to change roles every 2 years or 18 months. And how much can you gamble in those political business environments, because that's what they are, how much can you gamble in those environments to achieve outcomes at the expense of your own career? And unfortunately, culturally, a lot of folks took the career route, and I think that's one of the reasons some of this isn't done. But that's still not blame. You know, those are cultural choices too, because there's technologies available to solve those problems. Unfortunately, that's also cultural, because you have to trust the source of those things. You know, when somebody looks at your company and they don't see anyone who looks like them, they don't feel like you are their ally. They don't think you're there to help. And so this is one of the most important things that's happening in tech right now, is how do you engage everybody? How do you make sure that you understand them before you start talking? These are huge problems. And the more you work out in the world, the more you'll encounter it, and the better you'll get at it. There's not a playbook that you could take. There's no like top 10 list to make you good at dealing with all cultures. Certainly not one I think that will be effective.
Cool. All right.